All right, well, welcome and thank you to everyone for coming today. My name is Dr. Jelena Oxley, and I'm a professor of philosophy and director of the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and Values. We're grateful to the Jackson family for donating the money to make the work of the Ethics Center possible. And I think some of them might be here today, but I'm not sure. We've got a wonderful group of people here today. And I'm very appreciative to all of you for attending, and I'm grateful to the university for supporting this panel. I'm now going to ask everyone, as you might remember, just to turn off your cell phone so that we don't interrupt the event today. So you can put it on silent or whatever you need to do. I always forget to do that. I should probably do that to my own cell phone when I'm finished. Okay, so please know that there are members of the Coastal Carolina University family today who have been affected by the tragedy taking place in the Ukraine. As such, I ask that we enter together into a reflective space and that your thoughts and comments be guided by respect for each individual as a person. In a moment, I'm going to read a statement by CCU student Victoria Shoemaker, who I asked to be on the panel last week, but in the last 2 days has become a bit more stressed out by the situation taking place. I spoke with her last night on the phone, and she asked if I could read a statement instead of her participating today because she's just having a hard time the last couple days. So I'll be reading that in just a few moments. You're welcome to disagree with anyone who speaks on the panel today, but I ask that if you do, that when you direct your comments and questions, that we direct it towards people's ideas and not to them as a person or their character. Okay, so I'd now like to turn to our wonderful panelists who are on the stage with us today. The plan today is that I'm going to introduce them, and then each of them are going to make an opening statement of 3 to 5 minutes, and that should take around half an hour. After that, I will probably ask a couple of follow-up questions, and then we're going to turn it over to you as the audience to ask additional questions and open the event up for discussion. I expect us to end around 5:30, maybe a little bit after that, depending on how things are going. If you need to leave earlier, please do so quietly. Okay, so I'd like to introduce you to our panelists today. Dr. Christopher Gunn is Associate Professor of History in the Department of History here at Coastal Carolina University. He received his bachelor's in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia, too many degrees here, and a master's in political science from the University of Rhode Island, and a PhD in history from the University of Florida State. He spent over 6 years living and researching in Hungary and Turkey. His primary research interests include Turkey, Cyprus, the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Eastern Mediterranean, transnational political violence and reconciliation. He teaches courses on the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East, and Eastern Mediterranean, and terrorism. Dr. Mariam, and I'm going to try to say your name correctly. Dekanozishvili? Okay, see, I was close. Is Associate Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science here at Coastal. She received her master's in European Affairs from Lund University in Sweden, and her master's and PhD in political science from the University of South Carolina. Her area of teaching and research is the European and EU politics, with a particular focus on integration and policy making in the EU and EU and energy policy. Dr. Dekanozishvili has extensive professional experience in her field. Before coming to the United States, she worked for the Ministry of European Integration of Georgia. That's the Georgia in Europe, not the Georgia next door. And the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. She directs the Model United Nations team at Coastal. I participated that in high school and had a blast, so I'm glad you're doing that. Dr. Joe Fitsanakis is a professor of political science in the Intelligence and National Securities program. His undergraduate degree is from the University of Birmingham in England, and his master's and PhD are from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He has written extensively on intelligence collection, information security, cyber espionage, and sub-state political violence. Dr. Fitsanakis is a frequent contributor to news media such as the BBC, ABC, and NPR, and his work has been referenced in many outlets such as the Washington Post, Newsweek, Foreign Policy, Politico, and others. Dr. Jonathan Trerise is my colleague in the philosophy department. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. His undergraduate degree is from Cal State Fullerton, and he has a master's and PhD from the University of Missouri, Columbia. He wrote a dissertation on the moral foundations of intellectual property rights, and his primary research is on applied ethics and political philosophy, and he teaches courses in ethics, including a course in military ethics. Finally, we have Dr. Nataliya Alekseyenko, who was born in Moscow, Russia, where he received her BA in French, Russian, and English translation and interpretation. She received her MA in French to English translation from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she taught French. Dr. Alekseyenko was awarded the doctoral degree in translation at Kent State University in Ohio, where she taught courses in French, Russian, and translation, and we're very thrilled that she is now here with us at CCU. I'm now going to read our CCU student, Victoria Shoemaker, who's from the Ukraine. I'm going to read a statement from her before I turn things over to the panel. Hello, everybody. Firstly, I want to apologize for not being present at the panel today. The last 2 days have been very rough for me personally, and I'm simply too emotionally attached to the situation in the Ukraine right now. I would just like to thank all of you for supporting Ukraine during these horrific times. The past 27 days of Russian aggression have been a horror for Ukrainians all over the world. On February 24th, 2022, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the Russian army invaded Ukraine. Ever since then, Ukrainians have suffered from the bombings of civilian houses, apartment buildings, governmental theaters, hospitals, etc. Also, 2 Ukrainian nuclear plants have been occupied by the Russian army, one of which is located 2 hours from my parents' home. The workers of these plants have been held hostage for weeks. Hundreds of innocent citizens are killed by the invaders every day. So far, 117 children have died. These are statistics as of today, March 22nd. Those people who did stay in Mariupol, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, I'm not saying that right, I apologize, are living with no power, water, or heating system. All of these actions by Russian invaders are creating a huge humanitarian catastrophe all over the Ukraine. I want to shout everywhere that this is a total violation of democracy that is being condemned around the world. Ukraine is asking to close the sky because this is where the bombs are ruining the houses are coming from. I, as a representative of Ukraine, want to speak for the Ukrainian nation and for our President Zelensky to close the sky in order to save the lives of innocent people. Ukrainians are historically strong in spirit, and it is a courageous nation that cannot be broken. I also want to thank Professor Oxley and Dr. Darla Domke-Demont for their continuing support and for working closely on the projects that spread word and awareness of the Russian invasion in Ukraine here in our community. And thank you to the CCU community for your support. I'd also like to note that Dr. Darla Domke-Demont are you here? There she is. So she is here, and I'll be sharing at the end the Center for the Global Engagement, which she directs. There's a fundraiser, and she has some message forms with her if you'd like to see her after the event today. Okay, I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Christopher Gunn, who's going to get us started with a brief history on the Ukraine and the origins of the conflict today. Thank you.
That's Okay, thank you, Dr. Huxley. We thank you all for coming. I'm going to give a sort of a brief background and a little bit of a history. We'll see that the history of the Ukraine is a little bit complicated, a little bit more than I can squeeze into 3 to 5 minutes. Just a map here of where we are in the world. Again, some quick background information on the Ukraine. We're talking about the second largest country in Europe in terms of physical size. So the only country in Europe larger is Russia. They have a population of about 44 million people. The capital city of Kyiv, formerly known as Kiev, to at least my generation, is a city of about 3 million people. So this is what's currently, under siege and where we're hearing about developments continuously. Here, you might be able to see where some of the problem lies. The demographics of the Ukraine. You can see here there is a significant Russian minority. So about 78% Ukrainian, 17% Russian, which about 8 million is what that equates to. There are a large number of other small minorities in the country. In terms of linguistics, about 67% of the country speak Ukrainian as a first language. Almost 30% speak Russian as a first language. These languages are similar, but they are different, as I'm sure our panelists can respond to. Oops, sorry. They are Orthodox Christian. This is something else that they share with Russia. Orthodox Christianity brought to the region on the 8th and 9th centuries by the Byzantine Empire. So in this sense, a very long history and an origin of a national identity, which has been around for centuries. It is a little bit more difficult to pinpoint the country or the independent nation state of the Ukraine. You can see from this map of World War I, there is no Ukraine here, right? At this point, the area that we think of or that makes up independent Ukraine today spread out across the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This will change as these empires dissolve. At the end of World War I, Ukraine will be briefly independent, much like a few other countries that will be quickly absorbed in the reconstituted Russian Empire under the Soviet Union. But it's very messy here in particular. This is the area where the Russians will get out of World War I, sign a separate peace with the Germans, and then they'll get caught up in the Russian Civil War. Then there'll be a war with Poland. So the end of World War I, very messy. It's not really until 1922, when the Soviet Union emerges, that we get a sense, at least on the map of the Ukraine that we are talking about today. And so this will be established in 1922. It will grow, actually, over the course of the Soviet Union. You can see from this map the first major piece that is attached to the original Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic is a chunk of Poland, and this is obtained in 1939 in the secret agreement between Stalin and Hitler to divide Poland. Then they will suffer during World War II. I think this is important because it gets to some of the rhetoric that we're hearing about Nazis in the Ukraine. And so as Ukraine will come under the occupation of the German army, as the German army is advancing into the Soviet Union, there will be some collaborators in this region. For the most part, more along nationalist, sentiment, an opportunity here maybe to break away from the Soviet Union, but they will suffer. So Kiev will be occupied by the German army. They will be liberated, by the Soviet Union, by the Red Army in 1943. The next major piece that the Ukraine gets, which will be problematic and will be talked about, is Crimea in 1954. And so this is sort of that bottom chunk of the Ukraine, historically, in the imagination of Russia, this is a very important piece of territory. And it is signed over to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1954, and it has been problematic ever since. If we jump quickly to the end, in my 3 to 5 minutes, we get to 1989, 1991. The Ukraine is at the forefront of advocating for separation from the Soviet Union. They want their independence. I mean, ironically, and the Ukraine is not the only republic, nationalism and identity will flourish, actually, under the Soviet Union. We tend to think of the creation of a Soviet identity, but in many cases it was the opposite. So August 24th, 1991, their parliament will vote for independence. There will be a popular referendum in December of 1991, and 92% of the Ukrainian population voting population will vote for independence. This includes a 56% majority in Crimea, which had a 75% Russian population. And so this is what's happening 1991 as the Soviet Union dissolves on December 25th, and we get these new countries and the map changes. I will leave here, there were 3 elements from the beginning that made people a little bit worried about the Ukraine and Ukrainian independence. First and foremost was the nuclear arsenal that they inherit from the Soviet Union. Very quickly, on December 26, 1991, the Ukraine becomes in possession of the 3rd largest arsenal in the world. So a nuclear power. That is resolved fairly quickly, and they will denuclearize. What will linger is the Crimean issue. And 2 things here. First, this was the location of the Black Sea Fleet, and so important still strategically for Russia as it makes its way in the early 90s. And then third, the distribution of the Russians in the Ukraine. You can see here on this map the high density in Crimea, and then along, I could superimpose this of a map right now of where things stand, and it follows this fairly closely. This has caused tension since 1991. All right, so I'll leave that there, sort of the background and the history, and turn it over to Mariam. You next.
So hi everyone, thanks for coming. Originally I'm coming from Georgia. Which means that the war in Ukraine did not come as a surprise for me, because we've been there. So back in 2008, Russia did quite a similar thing in Georgia as well, to the extent that even the script was the same. Even the pretext that they are using in Ukraine is pretty much the same. And you will be surprised, but even the timing is the same. It's happening after the Beijing Olympics. Except that during Georgia it was Summer Olympics, now it's the Winter Olympics. So there must be something with the Olympics Games. So let's just not hold Olympic Games anymore. Of course, I have to run a little bit forward where Dr. Gunn left, so just for the sake of time. So I'm just going to talk about this very current 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So basically, this is how the events unfolded. Just 3 days before the invasion, we have President Putin's very angry speech. And English translation does not do justice. I have watched this speech in Russian, and this was the speech which was jaw-dropping for me. Basically, if you have listened to this speech, after the speech I told myself, oh my God, the war is here. At that point, I knew that he was going to invade, because the speech was full of resentment, the speech was full of anger, and speech was full of rewriting the history the way he pleases. Basically, in his speech, he says that Ukraine has never existed as an independent country. Moldova and Georgia never existed as independent countries. And he started history from Bolshevik Revolution in 1921, right? So that's where he started the history. But the history of these countries is very long. So it must be that Russians are reading different history books from everybody else. But anyways, clicker. So then what happens is that on February 21st, Putin actually recognizes, after this speech, he recognizes these 2 regions, which is called as Donbas region. So you have Lugansk and you have Donetsk regions, and he recognizes these 2 regions as independent states. So of course he's the only one. So it's like a repetition version of the Crimea scenario, right? Because this is what happened back in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. So he held a referendum, which by the whole world is illegitimate referendum. Only Russia is the only country who recognizes the referendum. So he wants to have the same scenario in Donbas region. And then on February 24th, Russia invades Ukraine, right? So that's the preceding events that's happening right now. So we have to talk about the reasons, right? So what are some of the reasons? Why is this happening at all? And we should understand that the problem is bigger. It's not really about Ukraine. If you think that this is only about Ukraine, if you think this is only about Georgia back in 2008, that's not true. Because if you look at how the events are unfolding, it's much bigger than that. So here I have basically prepared how Putin is trying to sell this to his domestic audience. So how he's trying to sell the conflict to Russian people, and what's the truth, right? So the way he's trying to explain this is that he was trying to demilitarize and denazify Ukrainian state, okay? So, and this is what you see in Russian newspapers. This is what you see in the Russian propaganda. So demilitarize and denazify Ukraine from those radical Nazi groups. So that's the Putin's main message. The second one, the second pretext that he's using is to protect Russian compatriots from a genocide. Okay? That's the second major message that Putin tries to convey through his propaganda machine in Russia. And finally, of course, he's trying to protect Russia from NATO threats. Okay? So next to this, you will see what the truth is. So basically, this is a pretext for what I call Russia's neo-imperial revisionism. Basically, what he wants is the reinstatement of the spheres of influences so that the whole post-Soviet space, and I don't like to use post-Soviet space basically, whole former Russian Empire space, because in Putin's speech, he didn't even talk that much about Soviet Union as he talked about the Russian Empire. So to reconstitute this space as under the dominance and under the influence of Russia. Russians have a term which is called Velikaya Держава. Those of you who speak Russian, you will know this. So this translates as greatness of Russia, right? So this is the revision of this idea. The second one is, of course, confrontation of the West, culturally, politically, economically, militarily. If anybody thinks, and I always tell this to my students, if you think that the Cold War was over, you're totally wrong, because it has never been over. It was just that Russia was too destroyed, too humiliated, and too weak to continue the Cold War. But it was dormant, but at the end of the day, when you regain power, and we know how the revisionist empires behave, right, or the former empires, how they behave, this is exactly what's happening now. The bear has awoken. So this is what I want to, how to symbolize this. And of course, Putin also wants to restructure European security architecture, because the existing security architecture in Europe, where the NATO is playing a dominant role, it's really against the interests of Russia, or at least this is what they believe. But there is really no facts of genocide found in Ukraine. There have been investigations launched by the International Court of Justice and also the International Criminal Court, but nobody found any evidence of genocide in Donbas region. So this was just a pretext that Putin's government is using in Ukraine. And finally, Ukraine is also not a NATO member. How can you talk about the NATO threat and use this as a pretext to invade Ukraine if Ukraine is not even a NATO member and is not going to be? And here is a very important background. Back in 2008, when there was George Bush Jr., he was the one who promised membership of Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova in NATO. And this is after Russia invades Georgia, back in 2008, right? But they had been promised membership sometime in the future. But because of France and Germany, the MEP, which is Membership Action Plan for NATO, has been rejected. So basically, the US said, we want these countries to be part of NATO, but then France and Germany said, no, they are not ready. So there was no political solidarity, there was no political willingness to embrace these countries. And since 2008, we've been promised and promised and promised, but it never came true. So there was really no immediate threat of NATO embracing Ukraine or Georgia. So to use this is very unlikely, right? This is not going to happen. Honestly, I'm not hopeful that this is going soon. So this was just using the pretext, which goes back to my main argument, which is that this is neo-imperial revisions, right? So he just wants to restructure the space in a way that puts Russia in an advantageous situation, which basically means telling these countries, such as Ukraine and Georgia, you don't have the right of choice. You can't choose the alliance, right? And if we are sovereign independent countries, we can choose our alliances. But this is what President Putin tries to avoid the neighborhood countries in his backyard. And I guess I have to stop here.
I think you can just go for the next.
Wait, how many minutes do I have?
I give 2 minutes.
2 more minutes, okay, so I'll be quick. So the next question is, how is Russia fighting this war in Ukraine, right? And this is a typical case of what we call hybrid warfare. So I'm just not going to concentrate on each and every aspect of the hybrid warfare, but I really want to pay your attention on the propaganda one. Because propaganda machine, this is something that Russia is winning this war at home. Because you have to sell, when you are going to have a full-scale invasion, you have to sell this kind of invasion to your own population. And unfortunately, he's been very successful in doing that. 76-80% of Russians, actually, I think if they don't like it, at least they are not against what's happening in Ukraine. Unfortunately, so his propaganda has been very, very successful. And of course, he's also using some irregular forces. There are even mercenaries, the so-called Wagner group. So these are the mercenary network paramilitary forces that used to fight in Syria, in Libya, and now they are fighting in Ukraine. Okay? So there's a cyber attacks that are happening almost continuously on the Ukrainian infrastructure, especially the military infrastructure. So we have this typical hybrid warfare going on in Ukraine. And of course, the propaganda machine, which is very strong, and we can talk about this in a Q&A session, because I think this is very interesting. So I have figured out kind of 9 main messages that you can find in major Russian channels and major Russian newspapers. So this part is the Putin's narrative, or how he wants to sell this to the Russian public. And then on the other side, on the right side, I have what is the truth, right? So responses to each and every propaganda question, which we can maybe go through next session, when we have Q&A session. And perhaps I'm just going to fast forward. This is how hospitals that have been bombed, educational institutions, religious buildings, and I'm sure you have seen these pictures. War crimes, which are right now being investigated by International Criminal Court. Ukraine has already submitted a case, and ICC will be discussing this case because there are so many cases of war crimes conducted during this invasion. And this is where we are now. And I'm going to stop here and perhaps talk about this because I don't want to encroach the time of other panelists. But at the end of the day, I want to show you guys this cartoon, which I think summarizes what's happening now in Ukraine, right? So this is the essence of the conflict. If you don't let me in, I'm going to, save you. What are you saving me from, right? That's from Ukraine. So I'm going to save you from what I'm going to do if you don't open the door. So, which I think is the best cartoon I have found during these last 3 days. Thank you so much, and hope to continue with some of these questions in the Q&A session.
I think I'll leave this in the background. It's pretty good. So it's all about the Olympics, right? So the Greeks are again in the center of the whole thing, clearly. I'm going to focus primarily on the tactical aspect of this whole thing. I am a lot less qualified than most of the panelists here to talk about the strategic sort of grand vision of this whole thing. I'm going to focus more primarily actually on what's happening at the micro level, basically what's happening on the ground in terms of combat operations in Ukraine right now. Now, I see it's pretty clear, I think, to everyone who's paying attention that the decision of the Kremlin to invade was basically premised on a sort of rapid military campaign. The goal was actually to have Russian troops in downtown Kiev by about 48 hours to 72 hours max. And in addition to that, Putin sent in the sort of GRU Special Operations Forces with the goal of actually going to Kiev ahead of everybody else and hopefully, in his view, kill leaders and decapitate the Ukrainian government, the idea being that, of course, everything else would collapse at the end of that. Now, it's clear that this whole sort of basic premise collapsed within about 72 hours. The Ukrainians not only did not surrender, but they actually began to barricade themselves inside the major cities. The most important thing that happened during the invasion is that the Ukrainians managed to beat back a major heli-borne assault on the Hostomel airport right north of Kiev. That, I would say, that's probably the biggest and most important battle of the war so far. Failure to capture the airport by the Russians meant that they could not then fly in units, troops, war materiel, and achieve their initial goal, which was to have troops in the center of Kiev within about 2.5 days. So in addition to that, the original kind of failure of the plan gave the Ukrainians time to barricade themselves basically inside Kiev. I'll come back to this because it's actually very, very important. Meanwhile, the Russian units they have faced no resistance in the north, practically speaking. And it's amazing, we kept looking at them making these amazing gains. I can't think of a parallel in recent history of warfare with an invading force going so quickly, making so much land, taking so much land in the process. But of course, that meant that they moved so fast that essentially the frontline troops began to be disconnected from the logistical units, the supply units. We started seeing all these Russian troops kind of wandering in the suburbs of different towns and cities without any kind of joined arms presence. I mean, which is actually kind of unthinkable. I kept thinking, what are they doing? Like, what is this? This is actually, I've never seen that before. By the time the Russians realized that actually overstepped that kind of mark with their progress, it was too late because the Ukrainians began then to attack, to ambush logistical units at the back. And by that time, it was too late to kind of make up for this logistical failure. So far I can describe the Russian performance in combat terms as unimpressive, no question about that. But I do want to caution people that we are far closer to the beginning of this war than we are to the end of the war. Also, Russian forces, are actually learning now from earlier setbacks, and we are starting to see them basically resemble what one would expect from a joint military operation using combined arms tactics, the kind of things you would expect to see at this point. They continue to have the upper hand. The correlation of forces is overwhelmingly on the Russian side. This is important to remember. And I'm very concerned about Kiev. I can tell, as I'm sure those of you who are watching this closely can tell as well, that the bulk of the Russian forces are heading to Kiev. Now, what they're going to do once they actually surround the city, if they manage to surround the city, is a matter of speculation, but it's actually very worrying to me. If they decide to take Kiev, we're talking here about a kind of an urban battle that we haven't seen since the days of World War II. Think about this. In terms of warfare, the size of these battles, the biggest urban battle we've seen since World War II was in 2016, 2017 in the Battle of Mosul in Iraq, where you had about 12,000 ISIS fighters and approximately 10 times the size of that in multinational force, including some American forces, that basically tried to take the city. Now, Mosul is a city, or was a city back then, of about 700,000 people, most of whom were civilians and refused to fight. Many of them left, actually, the city. We saw absolutely horrendous block-by-block war that lasted for about 7 or 8 months. Now, take Kiev as a comparison. Kiev has a population of about 4 million people, many of whom are civilians who are now armed. And in fact, they are willing and determined to fight. They're refusing to leave. In addition to that, they are surrounded by actual, military, professional military, who have artillery units. They have even anti-aircraft units as well. And I think if the Russians decide to actually go in, we are going to see the kind of urban warfare that would make Mosul, which was massive, look absolutely small by comparison. And of course, that brings the question of, if Putin decides not to kind of find an exit route and actually go for Mosul, for Kiev, is he actually going to basically sort of hack the system and go straight for a WMD type of attack using perhaps chemicals or even at some point sort of tactical nuclear weapons? At this point, I don't think anybody's comfortable saying absolutely not. That's very concerning. We can also discuss, of course, the possibility of NATO involvement, mass national resistance turning into an insurgency warfare in the coming weeks or months, morale among the Russian and Ukrainian troops, but I can leave that for the Q&A. So thank you. Right.
Hi. My expertise is rather different from the other panel presenters. So at one point in the previous weeks, I was caught between two seemingly contradictory reports that I kept hearing. One was that Putin has already lost. The EU, typically so divided, was decisive and rather unified against Russia. The sanctions, historic and crippling. The invasion, even if successful in the long run, took more resources and Russian lives. Putin has lost. But I also heard Putin has already won. He's demonstrated to the world that he's fearless and doesn't care about the consequences. If NATO goes to Ukraine, he'll fight even if he stands to lose. He'll play dirty. The message is clear and it's been received. Ukraine is not what it was. He's already won. So I was so confused about this security situation that even I, as a military ethicist, wasn't sure at first what I had to say about this event. But that's because of the tyranny of this moment and the haunting realism that I believe we all are tempted by whenever grand historical events like this occur. It distracted me from something I deeply believe and argue in other contexts. Quite simply, the ethics of this matters. So that's my focus. Many in the world believe, and perhaps even some of you believe, that ethics has no place in war. It's ugly and it's hell. It's no place for soft thinking. Part of the reason people think this is because of the very real truth that so many of our international conflicts are deeply complex, with significant historical background, such that it's hard to see anyone as being morally upright. To take just one example, consider the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. It's quite likely that war caused unrest in the region for a long time to come, and was probably started on false or at least shaky pretenses. However, simultaneously, the Hussein regime was particularly awful. He and his sons were monsters, and it's better that they're gone. So while my own view is that the war was morally problematic at best, one might wonder whether we can meaningfully discuss ethics at this stage, since there are so many factors at play. And one of the prominent features of the current crisis is this. Putin has made clear that there will be hell to pay if NATO encroaches on Russia. Don't be surprised if a cornered animal fights. You know what's coming, and so you're at least partially responsible for it. But these facts must not obscure two crucial points. That it is, in fact, not at all meaningless to talk about the morality of war. And I would also claim that Putin's invasion is unequivocally morally wrong. I can't fully prove this during this time. But here's why I think you already believe this. It's not meaningless to talk about the morality of war. Don't you think there are some things worth fighting for? Don't you think that the Ukrainian 63-year-old signing up to defend his family and his home is doing something worthwhile? By contrast, the Russian 19-year-old, confused and surprised at his circumstances, is not doing something worthwhile. Indeed, he's doing something he ought not do, or perhaps he ought not have been sent to do. And the Ukrainians are arguably doing something they must, or at least are morally praiseworthy for doing. If you think these things, which are highly plausible, this is the language of morality. You think it makes sense to talk about the ethics of war. And this same example shows the wrongness of the Russian invasion. There is no plausible defense for this Russian aggression. I believe this to be the case even if we should have seen it coming given NATO encroachment. To save time, I'll set my reasoning for that aside for the Q&A, although that kind of represents it pretty well too. Now, a critic might point to US hypocrisy, saying that the US has engaged in aggressive military campaigns constituting unjust war as well. Iraq and Vietnam come readily to mind. Well, I agree. We ought not be hypocrites. We ought to say we did wrong. This doesn't change, however, the wrongness of the Russian invasion. It isn't any less wrong because other countries have done wrong. We need to all be better. And we need to remember this moment the next time we engage in aggression. Ethics matters, and this war is deeply and totally wrong.
Now that we have covered the historical, political, and military aspect of this war, I would like to say a few things about how the lives of Russian people are affected by the war, what's going on in the Russian society from the social standpoint, especially as I know it from my family and friends. I've lived in Russia for 22 years. I received my bachelor's degree there, and I still have friends and family there. And no one I know is happy about the war. Everybody wants it to stop, and everybody is extremely sad about what's happening. So one of my friends is a scientist, and he's also an innovator. He has his company that developed those it's actually a bandage and a powder that stops bleeding very fast, and it's used now in the war zone. And he is a scientist who's been publishing his work in his field, and he shared with me that now basically Russian scientific community has been excluded from any exchange with scientists around the world, so they cannot participate in any conferences, they cannot publish their work in any journals, they cannot do any joint research with anyone. So basically he cannot pursue his career, as he is used to doing. And I just really feel for him, and I feel like people like him who are very bright and who I didn't ask him how he voted, but it's very likely that he didn't vote for the current president, for the current government. He may not like them. It just happened that he's been living in Russia. But now people like him are basically penalized, and I faced, he doesn't have a choice to continue doing what he has been doing for so long and what he's very good at. And basically, I think it's a loss not just for Russia or for him personally, but for the scientific community, just because there are many people like him. My other friend is a tennis player, and she, actually I went to her match at US Open. She played against Serena Williams, and it was a great match to see. And what she shared with me is that at Wimbledon, which takes place in Great Britain, Russian tennis players were allowed to participate, but under one condition. They had to basically prove that they are publicly denounce their citizenship. I think they had to publicly say that they are against the government and they're against the president specifically. And that was very unfortunate for her to hear. So first of all, she feels like athletes and cultural people involved in culture, any cultural public figures, they should have a choice of whether or not denounce their citizenship, whether or not say something against the Russian government. But also we've been hearing in the news that public figures who openly speak up against Putin or take any actions, public actions against him, basically don't end up very well, and they're either poisoned or killed. So they may simply not feel that it's safe to say that they're against the government or they're against the president. And those athletes, they also have families and they have children and parents, so they may not want to say that for that reason. Even if that's indeed how they feel, they may just fear to say that. So they just feel like they should have a choice to not say that if they don't want to say that. Likewise, there is a famous opera singer, Anna Netrebko. She is Russian, but she lived abroad. She lived in the US for a long time. She lived in Europe, in Austria, and she basically faced the same situation. She was not able to continue singing in Europe or anywhere in the world because she was basically told the same thing. She had to publicly express her, I don't know how exactly it was worded, but she did make a public post on Facebook saying that she had to denounce the country of her birth, and she doesn't feel like she should be forced to do that because she's not a politician, she's not an expert, and she's basically a person, a singer, and she wants to continue to sing, and that's the only thing she wants to do. So also, there is a lot of hate directed at Russian people online and in real life. Facebook allowed for the duration of the war to express hate towards Russian people. And again, there is no discrimination between people who support Putin's regime, people who live there, and people who may not like him at all, and they just happen to be born in Russia, or maybe they don't even have Russian citizenship anymore. So my friend who lives in DC shared with me a couple of days ago that the Russian restaurant there was destroyed, vandalized, and there was a lot of hate speech directed at Russian people, maybe Russian authorities as well, even though I don't know since it was in DC. And it turns out that the owner of the restaurant is not even a Russian person, he's from Moldova. So the question is whether or not that's helpful for stopping the war and how exactly that's helpful. So there are multiple acts of vandalism like this. And on Facebook specifically, there is a lot of hate speech directed at Russian people. And one of the comments I recently saw was, actually, it's a common friend who posted something like, they understand the feelings of the terrorists who were responsible for the explosions in Russian subway and Russian buildings. I think it was in the late 90s. And I think such rhetoric online and open space is very dangerous. It's not, I don't see how it's helping to end the war or how it's helping to establish peace. And I think it can have a very negative impact and actually have the opposite effect, especially given that there are very young people, very young minds who read those posts. And I think it's even dangerous to allow open hate like that. And then finally, so Russians in Russia also receiving constant messages, even on their cell phones, they basically calls for protests. So they're encouraged to go out in the streets and protest against the government, against the president. And that, again, can be, a dangerous advice to someone who may, if it's an unauthorized protest, they may end up in jail. So my friend just shared screenshots of those messages that they have been receiving from foreign numbers, from US numbers, from British numbers. And my dad even received a call. So it was Zelensky's voice saying something, along the same lines that they need to go out and protest. And it just, Russian people are very concerned and very, the situation they are in is also not a very good situation. And now their privacy is just violated like that by those constant messages and calls. They would get calls from soldiers who would say that they are dying and, urgent measures must be taken and people should go out and protest. So I basically just wanted to talk about that because, how ethical is it to hold people, the whole nation, accountable for the actions of the government, regardless of whether or not the given people support the government, whether or not they have, and most of the time they don't have the choice to change the citizenship. Another athletic competition I was following is CrossFit Games, and there I saw Russian names, Russian athletes. They didn't have a flag. Does it really change anything that they're not allowed to, use a flag, but they're still allowed to participate? So, well, I think it's about time to wrap up, but that's basically what I had to say.
All right, so we've heard a lot, and I've realized we're a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to go ahead and invite anybody who has a question to come on down to one of their microphones here, and you're welcome to ask your question of the panel. And I'll just talk until somebody gets down and sort of direct some things to our panel. It seems to me that what is being described here is that the Russians are definitely getting a lot of mixed messages and a whole lot of information, which is very confusing. Plus, they've got the threat of the KGB, sort of down their throats if they dare speak out against the government. So I think one of the questions that people ask is, how much is this going to escalate? Where is this headed? And that's a huge question. So I'm going to go ahead and give a couple people a couple minutes. Maybe Dr. Fitsanakis, I'll let you go first. Where do you think this is headed? And then I'll turn to Mariam and Chris.
Well,
Go ahead. They'll fix it. Just go ahead and keep talking. They'll fix it.
I was going to say, it's obviously this is the largest country in the world invading the second largest country in Europe. The sizes here are absolutely massive. There's no way that Putin has enough troops to take over the entire country, even a small part of it. Just to give an example of how small the Russian army is now. Back in the Cold War, Russia had more troops in Germany alone than the size of all the Russian land forces today. And that gives you a sense of how shrunk the army is, not to mention that even this current force that's there, it's actually a large part of it, I would say about 30 to 50,000 are actually conscripts, not actually professional troops. Which means that they're not even in a position to occupy, let's say, a city like Kiev. Even if they manage to occupy it, they can't hold it, right? So it is really difficult to imagine how the Russians are going to be able to get out of this mess that they got into. It doesn't necessarily make it any better for the Ukrainian or the Russian people from what we just heard, but it does mean that there's two possible exits at this point. One of them is that Russia is going to basically try to find a way out and declare victory by occupying some kind of land in the eastern part of Ukraine and kind of like calling it quits and calling it a day. or Putin is going to go basically all out to try to damage the industrial base of Ukraine as much as he possibly can in the next 2 or 3 months, and then leave basically a country in ruins, hoping then to declare victory at home. Any of those possible outcomes that I think the two most likely outcomes, there are others we can discuss as well, are actually quite distressing, and in my opinion, world security as we have known it went out the window really about 4 weeks ago.
Go ahead. Mariam, why don't you answer the question next?
Maybe I'm going to use my slide as well to add up on what Joseph said. So I think it's important to know that right now there are rounds of negotiations taking place. So yesterday, the 5th round of negotiation has just closed. And it's important to know what are the demands from the Russian side, right? And I have, there are actually 6 demands, but these 4 demands are the basic ones. So the first one is that is the Ukraine's neutrality, which actually means that Ukraine should never ever become a member of the NATO, right? So that's demand number 1. The second is some kind of disarmament. So that's the second big demand. The third demand is that Russian language should be protected, and this should be reflected in the Ukrainian constitution. So this is what Russia is demanding. And then next ones are about the eastern Ukraine. So basically Russia wants Ukraine to recognize Crimea formally as part of Russia, which has already been annexed, but Ukraine has never recognized, obviously. And also to recognize Donbas, Lugansk and Donetsk as independent republics, right? So these are the Russian demands. Now we can talk about which one is realistic, right? So which ones are realistic for Ukraine to accept. And also we also have to talk about how can West and Ukraine give something to Russia, because Putin also needs to sell something to its people. He started this whole mess, and now to just pull out without achieving anything, it will be reputational death for him. So that's why we have to think about, okay, what seems reasonable? So to give Putin space for face saving domestically, but at the same time, to let him say that, okay, I want something, right? So I got something out of this. So I think first 2, which is Ukraine's neutrality, is already, I mean, neutrality not in the traditional understanding of neutrality like Sweden or Finland, right? Because that's a very separate, it's a very big question indeed, right? So what Ukraine wants is the neutrality, but with the guarantees from international community. So it's going to be that Ukraine will say, okay, I'm not going to become member of NATO, and they already said that. Basically, President Zelensky said that it's okay. We're not going to become member of NATO, but then we need international protection from some big countries, including the United Kingdom, maybe United States, definitely, maybe, definitely United Kingdom, and maybe even Turkey and Israel. So there will be some kind of coalition which will guarantee the protection for Ukraine. That's going to be the neutrality. It's not like neutrality like Switzerland's neutrality, right? Yeah. So this could be acceptable, perhaps, maybe not so much for Russia, but at least for Ukraine, more or less so. When it comes to the protection of the Russian language, I think this should not be a big problem. I think Ukraine can concede on that one, have some legal mechanism to make Russian language protected. So, and that would also give Putin some face saving. He can tell his country, oh, I demilitarized Ukraine, and now Ukraine is going to be neutral. I don't think that average Russian will ask, okay, is this like Switzerland lack of neutrality? As long as you sell it, right? So Putin can say, I demilitarized Ukraine, which is true because they have lots of losses and damages. Basically, Ukrainian military infrastructure will be 1/3 of what it was before the war started, right? So he can claim this too and sell it to the public and save his face. When it comes to the last 2 demands, that's going to be unacceptable for Ukraine. And President Zelensky already made a statement, it was like 2 days ago, when he said that no territorial losses will be accepted by Ukraine. So this will be very hard. I think the biggest and hardest and most challenging part of negotiations will be the status of Donbas. So what's going to happen to Lugansk and Donetsk? And I think one of the possibilities, looking back to history and how Kosovo, for example, was governed for many, many years, could be some kind of maybe international administration, international protectorate, to make sure that these people, Russia claims there has been some ethnic cleansing, which is, I don't want to comment on that, but yeah, so maybe some kind of international protection. But definitely, I think Ukraine will never ever accept to recognize them as independent countries, which will be completely ridiculous.
Okay. Dr. Gunn, would you like to answer the question from a historical perspective?
Yes, no. So, I mean, as someone who studied and teaches about conflict since 1945, I mean, this is a game changer, right? I mean, this is something no one is expecting. We talk about intrastate conflict. Interstate conflict was supposed to be something, in the past. This blows a number of theories out of the water. Probably most infamously, the economist's Big Mac theory that no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war. I think that, and that might have already been violated. I have to go back and look, but this certainly does. To go back to Dr. Fitsanakis' point, I mean, we're looking at, all of the scenarios that end this are worst case scenarios, or bad. An occupation of the Ukraine is going to have a ripple effect throughout the region for years. Through my experience in Turkey and looking at this, how it's going to play out in Turkey, people will be held accountable once the fighting stops and everything is reevaluated. Allies and other aspects of the security infrastructure in that region are all going to be re-looked at. The worst possible case scenario, of course, is if Article 5 of the NATO alliance is triggered. And then trying to make sure it doesn't go nuclear. But even if that is triggered by accident or something happens, it could get very bad. And I would say right up front, I don't think Turkey would honor its NATO commitment if Article 5 is invoked.
Can you just clarify for us what Article 5 is, those of us who are not in the know?
The foundation of the NATO alliance, right? And that is an attack on one is an attack on all. So if Poland comes under attack, then everybody will join to defend Poland. So yeah, no, it doesn't look good. No.
Okay. All right. I have a question here.
Yes. First, I'd like to thank the panel for this very informative briefing. Thank you very much for taking the time. I'd also like to say that nobody in my circle puts any blame on the Russian people. I can't say that about all circles, but none in mine. But my question really has to do with what is happening in that southern city or the coastal city. Is it Mariupol? Is that how I say it? With the reported forced evacuation of civilians. What is happening with that, and why is that happening? And what's the ethical and tactical ramifications of it?
Okay, thank you. Mariam, why don't you go first?
Sure. So Mariupol has a very significant. Do we have a map here? Yeah. Right here. This is Mariupol, number 4. So why is Mariupol so important? Mariupol is one of the strategic. Mariupol is one of the strategic ports, together with Sevastopol, which is in Crimea, and Odessa. So by controlling Mariupol, which is on the Azov Sea, right, and then controlling Sevastopol, which Russia already controls because that's Crimea, and then also they are also encroaching on Odessa. They actually shelled Odessa 2 days, or maybe it was yesterday even. So Russia is going to have strategic control of Azov Sea spanning to the Black Sea. And if you have strategically controlling these areas, you can also project your power towards the Mediterranean and Carpathians, right? So this is a very strategic objective of Russia, to control all these basic ports, which is significant not just from the military purposes, but also from economic purposes, because these are huge commercial ports as well. So it has dual objective: militarily controlling Azov and Black Sea and projecting your power towards the Mediterranean Sea, and commercially controlling one of the largest ports on Azov Sea and the Black Sea. So that's why Mariupol is a very key strategic city. Plus, it is in the area where you have ethnically Russians living and Russian-speaking population. So this is a very strategic city in terms of its importance. So what happened today, as far as I know from morning's news, there was another round of bombing and shelling in Mariupol. There is a lot of civilian casualty from this morning. And they are trying to organize humanitarian corridors. So 2 days ago, they tried to organize to take out kids and women with buses, but unfortunately, there was so much arms used that they could not safely evacuate these people. And plus, when it comes to humanitarian corridors, there is one important point. Where do you open these corridors, right? So most of the Ukrainians don't want to go to Russia. So they want to go to Poland, they want to go to Hungary, they want to go to other places. But because Mariupol is very far away from those places, the place where they need to go, because this is the closest, they need to go to perhaps Rostov, which is close there, right? So they have to go to some city in Russia, which some of the Ukrainians don't feel like going there. So that's another question, right? It's geography, right? So I think that's why Mariupol is the key city, and why they are kind of trying to strengthen the attack on Mariupol, because they need to take at least one big city. And so far, Russia has not managed to take any of the big cities. They tried to bomb Kharkov, which is the second largest city in Russia. They could not take the city. They can't control the city. They can't take Kiev. I wanted to make this point. It's impossible to take Kiev. Joseph, I think you mentioned how much effort they are putting in this, but I don't think it's possible to take Kiev. Russia would need around 200 soldiers to take Kiev, because Kiev is very well strengthened at this point, so it will be impossible to take Kiev. They could not take any other large city, so that's why when somebody goes to Putin and tells him, oh, we have not taken any big city, I don't think it's a good news for him. So that's why they try very, very hard to take at least one big city. And Mariupol is the best candidate for that.
I'm also going to add very quickly that it's also symbolic and a message to other cities. The idea is if you don't surrender, this is what's going to happen to you. And it's not really that big of a difference to other examples. I can give you the example of the atomic bombs in Japan, right? That's the exact same message. And in fact, I've appreciated the comment about the parallels with U.S. policy, U.S. strategy. Putin's speeches often give America as an example of what they're doing. They're saying you did the same thing in Iraq in 2003. It was a war that you thought was fair, but nobody else did in the Security Council. You still did it, so we're doing exactly the same thing as you are. And in this particular case, you can point to the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Okay, we have another question.
I just wanted to say first and foremost that all of the people who I know do not blame the Russian citizens. We know the propaganda that's being fed to them, and everything that has been shut down so that they can't get any news from outside, and it's all state-run. But my question is, how much do you think the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and the taking of the millionaires' property and seizing the ways in which they can transfer funds from other places or get to their money, how much do you think that has an effect on how Putin is still driving forward with this campaign?
Okay. Who wants to go first?
Answer. So I'll try to answer this. Well, first of all, the sanctions are not exactly, so for example, SWIFT, I think some of you may know about SWIFT not working for Russia anymore. So for ordinary people like myself, it means that I cannot, let's say if Russia faces severe economic crisis, and that's what's predicted in the media, then, at least in the Western media, then, for example, if I wanted to help my parents out financially, there is no way for me to send them money. So I don't know And there are a lot of people like myself, so I don't know how I can even do that. At the same time, I know that Europe is still buying gas from Russia, and I heard that Gazprom Bank is still able to conduct operations and receive money. So again, I feel like when, if it's beneficial for other countries, then the sanctions, as long as it's beneficial for several other countries, I guess the sanctions will continue. Whether or not it undermines, the reputation of Putin in the eyes of the Russians, I think it's early to say, because so far the prices haven't gone up significantly. There are no shortages of anything as far as I know. So their lives, they're not able to travel anywhere, but they were not able to travel anywhere because of COVID and because the Russian vaccine was not recognized in other countries. So life hasn't changed significantly enough for them yet to say that they changed their opinion if they supported Putin, that they no longer support him. So I think this will become more clear after some time.
So let me add a little bit on the sanctions and how effective they are. I think they are effective because it's not really about just, of course, I feel for Russians who cannot use their own MasterCards and Visa cards. My husband is Russian and he actually lost 1/3 of his savings. So this is actually personal for me as well. So it really impacted my pocket, but this does not let me justify what the Russians are doing. Even if I go bankrupt, I'm still going to be for Ukraine in this battle, because there is really it's not really about your pocket. It's about what is morally right and morally wrong. And Ukraine, in this case, is morally right. So we don't have to talk about, how I'm suffering, because who is really suffering today is the Ukrainian people who are dying every day. So this is who is suffering, and not us who cannot use our bank cards, or my husband who cannot use his bank card. So what goes to the effectiveness of the sanctions, they are effective. We have to if you remember when it was in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, the sanctions were very light. Indeed, those sanctions, when I looked at the sanctions and what they were trying to sanction, I was laughing because it was obvious that this would not work at all. Now sanctions are very hardcore, and these are working because I can tell you what's going to happen. The ruble already lost 38% of its value. So obviously, all Russians who had savings in their deposits, in their bank accounts, now they are feeling it on their own pocket, right? So when you elect your president with 76, 77 approval rate, maybe you also need to be held accountable a little bit, right? So when you are electing the president, that means that public is supporting the president. So should we not hold this public accountable? I mean, not individual Russians, I'm not picking on anybody, but as a public, as a society, when we are electing president who is a crazy guy who wants to occupy the neighboring country, maybe we should also think about why am I electing this person? And he was elected with 77% or 75 or whatever it was above 70% of approval. Right? So the sanctions are also working because Russia is going to be technologically very impacted. You know who produces the 95% of processors and microchips? It's Taiwan. And Taiwan already put sanctions on Russia. So I think in 2-3 months, some of the largest factories of Russia who are producing some machinery, who are producing computers, who are producing airplanes, they're going to stop. And I have seen the reports today that some of the big factories have already stopped because they don't have components to produce their material, right? So it's impacting. So sanctions do have very, very big impact. And SWIFT was very important because at this point you can't really do any international transactions from Russia with anybody, with any Western partners or Japan and any other country that impose sanctions. And finally, I can say that 25,000 Russians have just traveled to Georgia because they want to avoid sanctions. They went there to register their businesses. I know it from my own friends who just rents Airbnb apartment, and there have been at least 200 Russians who wanted to rent this apartment. They come to Georgia because it's a neighboring country, it's very close, and they register their businesses so that they can open bank account and they can use the Georgian cards to withdraw their money. Are sanctions working? Oh yes, they are.
Anybody else like to comment on that?
Excuse me. So I have a question for the other panelists. On the theory that philosophers are typically better at asking questions than finding answers, I'm going to continue that. There's so many aspects of this that, as I've indicated, confuse me. Some of the good news is often also bad news in so many dimensions. So one is the sanctions. Yes, I agree with what I've heard as far as I understand these things, but we also know sanctions typically hit civilians hardest, at least initially. Simultaneously, he can't take Kyiv. That sounds great. I'm happy to hear that. Oh no, what will he do when he knows he can't take Kyiv, when this truly becomes clear? That terrifies me, that increases the doomsday type moves when that reality sets in. So if someone could make me feel less terrified, that would be lovely.
Okay. Who's the least doomsday person on the panel, I guess?
No. Unfortunately, it's probably me, too.
Okay, so we have some pretty high-level doomsday. So on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your doomsday rating? Just curious.
Mine's pretty high because that's what I meant before when I said the idea of world security as we've known it about 4 weeks ago is going out the window, no matter what the outcome in Ukraine is. Even if Putin turns around and goes back home tomorrow, the fact that this actually happened is absolutely chilling for world security. Not to mention, let's say the sanctions do work, and let's say they have the ultimate effect, which is to create a regime change situation inside Moscow, inside the Kremlin. That's not going to be a very easy process. And to destabilize the politics of a country that has 4,500 nuclear warheads makes me very, very uncomfortable. And so I just don't see how the world we woke up on, the 23rd of February is at any rate the same as the one we're going to be waking up, say, even tomorrow or today. Sorry about the bad news.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And so on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say I'm about a 7. Because again, even when this is over, then we're going to start going back and paying attention to things that we've neglected over the last few weeks and months. And again, to bring us back to the region, there are countries that were precarious, are still precarious, like Egypt and Turkey, with economic problems, and Lebanon is in collapse, that we're not focusing on. And Egypt and Turkey in particular, a tremendous amount of their economy is on Ukrainian and Russian tourism, which they are not getting. And so, plus all of the money that we're spending that is being redirected from COVID funds and other things. So, once it's over, we're going to have to still spend some time cleaning it up.
Okay. What's your number, Mariam?
It just depends what is the definition of doomsday, right? So if we define doomsday as economic crisis and recession all across the world, and even food crisis, because now United Nations has just announced that Russia and Ukraine, as we all know, they are the biggest producers of grain. So this is going to impact the food supply. So there might be some disruptions in food supply chains. Obviously, I agree with both of my colleagues that it's not going to be good, obviously. But if we define doomsday as the use of the nuclear weapons, and if the question is Russia going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, I don't think that Russia will use. Putin is not going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and I'm going to explain why very quickly. So first of all, because before he uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine, everybody knows that that's going to be beginning of the Third World War, right? And before he uses that, before he pushes that button, he will be killed by his own own domestic circles by the oligarchs, because it's in nobody's interest. It's not interest in the Russian people. It's not interest of the circle that surrounds Putin. So he will be eliminated before he does that. That's one reason. The second reason, if he wants to occupy Ukraine, no matter whether it's just Donbass or Kiev or whatever, why would you nuke the country that you want to control? Why would you want to annihilate and destroy the infrastructure of the country? Then he will be the one who has to build it again, right? So it's just not rational to do it. I think the only way that Putin can use nuclear weapon, tactical weapon, if he ever uses one, will be in Poland. Because he's going to, if he wants to drag in NATO, Poland would be the best candidate to use it. Even though I think, I would not say that this is highly likely, but if this happens, this will be Poland, not Ukraine.
Okay, this is great. All right, got a couple more questions. Yes.
What is the best case scenario on how this ends, and how can we repair the damages that have already been done?
All right, great question.
New pandemic to distract us. I'm being somewhat silly, but actually maybe I kind of agree with this silliness that I'm suggesting, that humans have short attention spans, and perhaps we get around this with having a new crisis. And maybe it's a crisis which is less doomsday-ish. I think I had a follow-up question for Dr. Dekanozishvili, but we'll let the student. So.
Okay, well, let's hear your question. Thank you.
Do you think that China will follow suit of Russia and try to invade Taiwan at some point soon?
Can I jump on this? It's actually great to have questions from students, first of all. And second, that's a great question, right? And I have a theory about this. It's very elaborate, which is that China is going to keep its power dry, and it's going to wait until the right moment to intervene and play the role of basically the up-and-coming power that is going to basically help resolve the problem in a situation that's very similar to, say, what the U.S. did in the Suez crisis. Kind of let the others fight it, and then kind of jumped in and said, okay, now the big dog is talking, kind of thing. And I think that we'll see if that happens, but that's my kind of like my best guess on that.
That's a great question.
So, just a thought. I'm actually a professor too, and so some of this stuff. And just in response to the question about a way that this could end well, stalemate. It's hard to get inside Putin's head, but I have seen a compelling argument that what he's engaged in, insofar as he views the Ukrainians as disloyal Russians, is akin to an honor killing. And it may be that he just has to get a sense of vindictiveness out of his system, and that if he satisfies his urge to punish just enough, then he can, given his complete control of the information environment in Russia, even if we don't give the Russians much of anything, he can tell his people whatever he wants. So he doesn't actually have to gain anything tangible to claim victory, given his control of the information environment. So let him get his urge to punish out of his system, fight him to a stalemate, and then what is largely a liability for us, a concern, his dominance over the information environment, let him use that to his advantage as his own off-ramp to construct his own narrative of, I have demilitarized the Ukrainians, when all he's done is fought them to a bloody standstill and killed people needlessly. But he can still say that, okay, like you pointed out, Ukraine has 1/3 of the military they did. That's probably the best case scenario, I think.
Boom, that was great. So this is Dr. Ferrero, who was actually talking about Ukraine in 2016 when nobody else was, and he tells me that he now feels like he had discovered this band that he was listening to, and now everybody else is listening to it.
Yeah,
and that's how you feel, right?
Now
Everybody's listening to it, yeah.
Daka Braka, or which band?
Oh, it's just a metaphor.
Yeah. It's a metaphor.
I thought you were being serious, that you found a real band.
No, it's like Ukraine was the cool band that I was talking about when no one else was. And now everybody is caught on.
All right, we're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to have one more question, and then I'll close at 6, but everyone can stay after and talk to the panelists. So go ahead and ask your question.
So my question is, so as John Locke would say, the nature of man is that your ability to kill me is the same as mine to kill you. Has Ukraine proved this by how long they have survived against Russia? And no matter the outcome of Ukraine, will this change the balance of like sort of state of peace that we know of, like this world peace that we know? Will it be gone for the rest of our lives probably? No matter whether NATO get involved, Russia just pulls back, no matter what happens, is the idea of the peace that we have known for so long just out the window?
Yes. Basically, I think that the idea of kind of a system in some kind of equilibrium is it's history at this point. No matter what happens in Ukraine, and that's I don't think Americans understand the significance of what just happened on the 24th of February. But I would advise every American to be paying close attention to the geography of Ukraine, of Poland, of Georgia, of all of these places that are going to become pretty central in our lives in the coming years.
I want to ask a closing question, and maybe you can wrap your comments around this question. Many of us in here, I grew up in the 80s, and, the threat of nuclear war was imminent. As a child going through this, I thought, oh, wow, it's going to happen at any day. And then the Cold War happened, and I was one of these people who thought it was all over. And now I've come to learn I was sorely wrong and just not paying attention. So I think I have a big question about what's the role of Americans. We have the question about the role of American government. We know historically that we tend to enter these things later, waiting for things to really reach a fever pitch before we get involved. And it sounds like there's some speculation that China might be playing the same role. What are some things that might affect us as Americans moving forward? Because we know historically from the world wars that have taken place previously that there's consequences here in America. For example, the Japanese internment camps during World War II. Are we looking at anything like that happening in terms of, I've seen a lot in our local community, the local radio station, 92.1, changed its name for a weekend to Ukraine. I went to a local bar yesterday just to play games and had no idea that the local bar was having an event, a fundraiser for the Ukraine. We are seeing a lot of pro-Ukraine. And in fact, I've got a fundraiser to share on the behalf of the Global Society here at Coastal. What are we looking at for us as Americans moving forward?
Would I be able to add a little bit?
You want to add a little bit to that? Okay, great.
Question.
And then we can wrap up because I know we're running very late. Thank you all for your patience.
I guess just in consideration with that question, what we're seeing in response from right-wing groups, and some politicians over in America, of legitimizing Putin's claims with, as you mentioned, our same reasoning that we had with Iraq and Vietnam, with Israel, Palestine, all that. And we are seeing that as part of the propaganda machine also online, of Americans having at least part of our political imagination agreeing with what would be a more like Russian nationalist viewpoint. And just like, how does that play into all of this as well? And do we have a responsibility to change that, all that?
Okay, thank you. All right, so we can hear from maybe each person as a closing remark.
Just very, very briefly, Americans can't do much to convince Putin, like you and I, average individuals, to change his policy. What we can do is put pressure on our own government to follow international law, because every time our government doesn't, there's many instances where they haven't, it opens up Pandora's box. Others can then say that if you respect international law, then we're not going to do it either. The Greeks used to say in the ancient times that the law is like a spider's web. It keeps the small insects that get caught, but the big ones run right through it or fly right through it. And that is very true today. Every time we don't follow international law, it gives a chance to a dictator like Putin to do the same. It's a bad example.
I guess my follow-up to that is perhaps predictable. I already said that I thought the invasion was unequivocally wrong. And sometimes there is a nice connection between self-interest and ethics, not always. So along with this, doing the right thing here is also in our interest in the long run. As he said, resist the tide of misinformation. Ask for evidence. Everybody has their biases. Don't just assume that the other side is biased and you're not. Evidence, 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 and let the evidence guide us towards trying to do what's in line with international law, and that will serve our interests in the long run as well. So don't believe the lie that all there is national interest. That is in fact what animates Putin, and that's what we need to resist.
So I think the final remark will be that as far as people in Russia, and I think everywhere in the world, the worst case scenario is, of course, the Third World War and a nuclear war. And I know that a lot of people in Russia are concerned about how much support, how much the West can take as far as situation in Ukraine, and whether or not NATO will get involved. And while they don't think it will happen, the hope is that the world war will be avoided. But I know there is such a fear, and hopefully the situation will get resolved, until the sphere actually materializes, and it's a likelihood of that happening increases.
Very good, thank you.
So going back to the question of what America can do, what the United States can do, I think I agree with Joseph. So when you have a misbehaved teenager, what do? You just be a role model. That's what you do, right? So basically what you do is just you stop political hypocrisy and you stop double standards yourself. That's what you do.
I'll address, I guess, from a historical sense, this idea of how we should react to this, on the ground level. And we've heard some disturbing things, but, we have yet again another opportunity not to sort of target Russian or Russian Americans for a conflict that we disagree with. But unfortunately, this is something we've always done. The Japanese Americans that you've mentioned, but also the Iranian hostage crisis. We went after Iranian Americans, 9/11 Arabs and Sikhs, because certain people couldn't tell the difference, would target those groups. Asian Americans during most recently during the pandemic. So, this is something that America historically has done. We don't like something, we lash out. I think we have an opportunity here not to do that, and hopefully, that is at least something that we should do. And we'll see how that unfolds.
Very good. So I wanted to share with you a fundraiser that's being organized by Dr. Darla Domke-Demont, the Global Engagement Office. And this is a fundraiser, a GoFundMe, and this is all humanitarian relief. You're probably aware of other organizations as well. There are a number of organizations that are collecting funds for donations of humanitarian relief. So if you're interested in donating to this one, this is the one that CCU is organizing. All right, thank you all very much for coming today. And our job is to promote thought and discussion. So hopefully we've left you with something to think about today. Please take it to someone in your circle and share with them what you learned today. Thank you and have a great day.